Hi guys. Okay, so week 6, Rosemary's Baby. So Rosemary's Baby was released in 1968. It's based on a best-selling novel of the same name, and it stars Mia Farrow and John Cassavetes, who himself would go on to be one of the most influential and kind of most admired independent directors in American cinema in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. But he started off as an actor. As a young couple, Guy and Rosemary, who move into a 19th century apartment block in Manhattan with the intention of starting a family. While Rosemary is initially thrilled with the apartment, she becomes increasingly frustrated with the couple's interfering elderly neighbors, the Castavets. And the film follows Rosemary's painful and disrupted pregnancy, during which time she's kind of watched with increasing intensity by the Castavets, who kind of become more and more creepy as the film goes on. The couple exercise an influence over Guy, and she becomes increasingly suspicious that they are witches and that they are planning to steal her baby. And the film kind of takes on this very intense paranoid atmosphere as Rosemary attempts to escape from the clutches of the people who she becomes convinced are trying to do her harm. And it ends with a very memorable scene in which it's revealed that she has actually given birth to the child of the devil. And she chooses to stay and to kind of raise this child with the coven of witches who have taken advantage of her. And we'll speak a bit more about the final scene at the end. It's of a markedly different tone to the rest of the film. So some people hate it, some people think it's really great. But yeah, that's a broad outline. Hopefully you've seen the film by now. There shouldn't be any spoilers in there for you. So we'll just talk about what it is that I think is interesting about this movie in terms of some of the themes and the ideas that we're going to be talking about on the course. So, first things first, Rosemary's Baby it's a film, more than anything, it's a film about an apartment and an apartment building, and it's a film about domestic spaces within the city, domestic spaces being private spaces, the spaces in which people live rather than the spaces in the city in which people walk around and encounter each other. So Rosemary's Baby opens and closes with two aerial shots of what is called the Bramford apartment building, in which Rosemary and Guy spend most of the film. That's not the real name of the building in Manhattan, but obviously the shot that you see of the building is of a real building. And the opening shot takes in this kind of long aerial establishing shot of New York and of Manhattan specifically, and it's worth kind of watching and thinking about this shot because it serves one purpose, which is to immediately establish the film as taking place in New York. It's quite a recognizable skyline. You see the skyscrapers, and you also see you see Central Park, you see the Hudson River. But you also get this kind of impression of New York as being constituted by a lot of different styles and a lot of different competing kinds of histories. You see old, grandiose apartment blocks like the one that Rosemary and Guy move into, but you also see kind of big, grey, dull social housing. You see parkland. You see all this different kind of stuff, buildings built with different purposes by different architects in different styles. And yeah, this is all part of New York, but you also get the sense that the city itself is really made from these kind of different competing histories and different competing movements and periods in time, which all get kind of mushed together in the city as it's experienced in day-to-day life. And we'll talk about this more, especially in relation to Blade Runner, but this opening shot really does establish something about urban life from the perspective of its architecture. And in the final moments of the shot, which we'll just look at now very briefly, we see actually Rosemary and Guy walking into the building that they're going to be shown around and where they will spend the majority of the film. So we'll just watch the last 20 seconds now. The camera kind of settles on the Bramford, and there they are, Rosemary and Guy, just down here. Classic creepy music. And as soon as they go in, it cuts to them inside the building. So it cuts down and we see them inside, but we see them initially as very small figures entering this kind of building, which appears to overwhelm them. And we can think about what this immediate establishing shot and in this immediate sight of the couple does. It makes them appear very small in the face of the building. They are kind of anonymous. They could be anyone. And they are doing kind of a generic thing. They are going there as a young couple who are planning to start a family and they want to move into a new apartment. This is very much part of an image of what a kind of good middle-class life would be for a young, attractive couple like Guy and Rosemary. So there's something very generic about the two of them and about the kind of life that they're leading. There's something that we might say which is quite aspirational about the kind of life that they're leading. And once we're inside the apartment, we see a kind of different perspective. As they're being shown around, the estate agent relates the history of the various changes which have taken place in the building's architecture. We talk about things, rooms being chopped up, mashed together, apartments kind of become smaller so that more people can live in them. And we have this kind of contrast between the Bramford as a kind of big edifice, stationary on the outside, quite imposing, and the kind of movements and changes that happen on the inside in order to accommodate the different people who are passing through it. And again, we see in the opening scene, you can watch this on eCampus, I'm not going to play through the whole thing now, but we see the way in which the building that they want, the apartment they want to move into, that Rosemary decides they want to move into, is very cluttered with plants and with things that belong to the previous resident, who we are told has died and is in a coma, who died while in a coma in hospital. All of these things make a lot more sense when you watch the film for the second time around, and it's very clever the way that it kind of lays these signs for you all the way through, actually, that something is very wrong in the apartment. But at this moment, it's not totally clear what's going on. And in Rosemary's head, all she can really think about is getting rid of everything which is in the building. Or in the apartment, and kind of starting again. And she talks about how the wallpaper would look good if it was different, and she just kind of, in her own head, she's already cleared out everything which is in there, and she's ready to impose her own view and her own vision on it. And in the scene in which they move in, which again you can watch on eCampus, they kind of sit there and they have a takeaway when they have no furniture in the apartment. It's this kind of classic celebration of moving in somewhere. And Rosemary decides to mark she says, hey, let's make love. They want to kind of, be together for the first time in the apartment on the night that they move in. And significantly, at that moment, they also hear the neighbors. They hear the noise of the people who live next door. But we will talk a bit more about that in a second. So yeah, Rosemary pays no attention to the signs that things are wrong when they move in. She doesn't pay attention to the note, which, when you watch it a second time, it says that the person who used to live in the apartment will no longer associate herself with the cast of vets. And she doesn't pay attention to, or she doesn't think about the fact that the closet has the this huge cabinet has been moved in front of the closet, which in the final scene of the film you realize must have been in order to protect the person who was living there from the Castevets, because there is a secret doorway from the elderly couple's apartment into Rosemary's apartment, but we don't find that out until the very end of the film. So yeah, Rosemary's thought when she moves in is just to get rid of everything, is to start again, is to kind of cleanse the apartment of the old and to make it a new, modern, stylish building on the inside. And, you know, I say here, and this is one way of reading it, is that this kind of middle class life that Rosemary wants to have in the building is defined by the ability to erase a previous history of the building itself and to start again. That's kind of what still we think of sometimes as moving in somewhere. People want to get rid of the previous history of a space and want to be able to start anew within the building. And we have this kind of contrast between the old edifice, the outside, which appears very dated from a very specific historical period, and the inside, which Rosemary is able to remake according to trends in interior design. I'll post a link to this. There's quite a funny article about interior design in Rosemary's Baby and how influential the film actually was in establishing a certain kind of decorating style. Like people wanted to live in an apartment like Rosemary's apartment, which when you see the film, you might think is quite strange, but it's supposed to be very chic. It's supposed to be very stylish. It's supposed to be a very modern living space. And part of the film's creepiness and its kind of part of its gothic or its horror element, when you think about it, is this idea that the history that you try to remove from this kind of apartment building, from this kind of living space in the city, it never really goes away. And the city is a place in which these kind of attempts at erasure are never really fully complete. They fail, and in Rosemary's Baby they fail in pretty massive ways. And as I say at the end, in Rosemary's Baby, it is the apartment, the urban domestic space, in which mythical pagan influences press on modern life. So it's this space which kind of fulfills or which mirrors what we saw in Metropolis, which I keep coming back to, but it is something that is very common in urban cinema or cinema about cities. That something mythic, something old, something not associated with modern life comes back in some form or another. And in Metropolis, it was in the factory. In Double Indemnity, it was in the kind of insurance business. And in Rosemary's Baby, it's in the space of the apartment itself. Okay, something that all apartments have usually is neighbors, and the kind of neighborly relation is something which is very important in Rosemary's Baby. So the apartment building is a place in which people lead isolated, individualized lives, but in which they often do so in very close proximity to others. And in the scene that I just talked about, where Rosemary and Guy first move in, and Rosemary says that she wants to kind of mark the moving in by making love for the first time in the apartment. They hear the neighbors, they hear the kind of Castevets. They haven't met them yet, but they hear them for the first time, just kind of chatting in the next room. And you get this kind of inside-outside relationship in which the neighbors in apartment blocks, and this happens now, obviously, they are often strangers. People often don't speak to their neighbors and often don't have a real relationship with them. However, at the same time, they do overhear each other's kinds of, sometimes very intimate lives. And as much as Rosemary's apartment is about, as much as Rosemary's Baby is about an apartment, it's also about neighbors. I think. And it's also about this kind of liminal relationship which you have with your neighbors, which, if you remember from Taxi Driver, the word liminal means something which is kind of on the border between being inside and outside. And neighbors are not people necessarily with whom you have a very close relationship, but they are people who in some ways can be almost right inside your home. Sometimes you can hear them, and it's this separation from the people around you, but at the same time the capacity for these people to kind of bleed into your life, which I think is used a lot in Rosemary's Baby in order to create kind of sense of dread, sense of paranoia. And yeah, the Castavets use this, use part of the neighborly relationship to insinuate themselves into Guy and Rosemary's lives, specifically they use this idea that you should be polite and you should entertain your neighbors, you should be friendly, and they are able to essentially force themselves at points on Rosemary, especially under the guise of being good neighbors. And at the same time as they do this, Rosemary also overhears things about them, and she hears and she sees things about them kind of half out of the corner of her eye, which deeply worry her. So all of this then is about domestic space, I think, essentially. And we can say that Rosemary is able to exercise agency over her domestic space, over her domestic environment, in terms of decorating and by realizing her ideas for the details of the apartment. So, as I said, it's quite an influential film in terms of interior style. It's a very deliberately stylized movie. Rosemary's fashion is very carefully considered, and at one point she gets her haircut at Vidal Sassoon, which is one of the most trendy, cool hairdressers in New York at the time. It's kind of a magazine lifestyle, almost, you could say. At the same time as the domestic space being the space in which Rosemary is able to express herself, and the space in which, you should say, she herself wants to kind of wants to make her own, it's also the space in which she becomes increasingly unable to talk, unable to be listened to, unable to have anything that she is saying or thinking really affirmed about what she is, about how she's feeling. And we see this for the first time really strongly in the scene in which Minnie gives Guy the dessert that that they're going to use in order to drug her. And he insists that Rosemary is wrong to say that there is a chalky undertaste to the dessert, despite the fact that he knows that she is not mistaken. So Guy we use the term gaslighting in English to describe an abusive situation in which usually a female, but not exclusively, I think, is not just lied to by their partner, but is made to feel that their own experience is invalid. I know there are a couple of people here who did Shakespearean comedy with me last semester, and if this sounds a little bit like The Taming of the Shrew, it's because it is. But that's a different class, I guess. So yeah, the domestic space becomes a space in which Rosemary tries to organize her life, but it's also the space which is dominated by these kind of other influences, by the Castavets, or becomes increasingly dominated by the Castavets, and Guy and his insistence on refusing to allow Rosemary to recognize her own experience and refusing to recognize Rosemary's own experience is kind of the conduit and in some ways the key to that kind of influence. And again, when you watch the film again, you see when Guy and Rosemary first go for dinner at the Castavets that Roman Castavets, the husband, takes Guy aside, and you realize that that's the time when he kind of brings Guy in on the whole conspiracy, and that for the whole rest of the film, Guy is effectively working for the Castavets against Rosemary. But you don't necessarily see that until you've watched the whole film through for the first time. And then later, Rosemary and Guy have the argument after the party in which she insists that she wants to see another doctor, and Guy says that she can't, that the pain will pass, that she has a duty to the Castavets to make sure that she doesn't hurt their feelings, kind of all these things which are really kind of hallmarks of abusive relationships, really. Which again is something that Rosemary's Baby puts on the screen, I think, quite acutely and quite accurately. It's worth noting that Rosemary does not entirely... She never really acquiesces to this. She never stops trying to make her voice heard. She never actually believes that she's wrong. But at certain times, she does have to kind of accept the fact that perhaps she doesn't have very much power in this situation. Where is she going to go? And yeah, this agency is chipped away as Guy and the Castavets refuse to legitimate her concerns. And in several scenes, we see the way in which the camera kind of creates a sense of claustrophobia within the apartment, and it constructs the apartment as a space which becomes increasingly stifling for Rosemary and becomes increasingly closed off. And when you watch the film, pay attention to the way in which corners, walls, doorways are presented, and the way in which you kind of move from this scene when they move in and there's nothing there, in which there appears to be a big empty space and a lot of potential, into this stifling, stilted, claustrophobic environment, which is nonetheless an environment that in some ways Rosemary has created for herself. And then we have the party scene, which I think is important because it kind of shows a female solidarity within the film, and it's also something that takes place in the kitchen and a space from which Guy is removed. So we see the way in which when Rosemary's friends actually kind of talk to her about how she's feeling, and she says that she's been in pain for months and that that she doesn't feel well at all, and they kind of respond with horror and kind of say you have to go and get help. Yeah, we'll talk about this more with Born in Flames, which is a very different movie to Rosemary's Baby. But we do see at least a potential for the kind of domestic space here to be reclaimed in some way, with a kind of exclusive solidarity. And it's obviously no coincidence that Guy is kind of kicked out of the room at this point, even though he desperately tries to come in. And as you watch the film again, and you know that the reason that he's trying to interrupt this conversation is because he doesn't want Rosemary to go and see another doctor. He's made a deal with the Castavets that he will kind of make sure that Rosemary is forced to see this pregnancy through to the end according to their conditions. However, I think something the film also does is it, when you're not entirely clear what's going on yet, when you haven't seen it all before, Guy's behavior doesn't seem that uncommon. Like, lots of relationships like this do exist. You don't need a kind of supernatural pact with the devil in order for a male partner to refuse to legitimate the concerns and the experiences of their female partner. So I think something which is interesting about Rosemary's Baby is the extent to which the actual main plot, the kind of horror element of the film, is necessary or not for any of the behaviors of the characters. And yeah, talk about that. So we also have a use of public space in the film. And I think the use of public space in the film is quite brilliant, actually, because it really changes, or it uses the kind of anonymities that we've spoken about previously in relation to Taxi Driver and Double Indemnity, but it uses them in a different way, and it uses them to produce a very unsettling effect. And yeah, we can see this in two scenes. The first scene is quite early on in Rosemary's pregnancy, and she kind of just says, right, I'm going out. And she tries to meet Hutch, her friend, an old landlord who warned her about the building before she moved into it. And she just goes out into Manhattan, and everyone's Christmas shopping, and she kind of appears to have at least a moment of relief where she feels as if she isn't being watched, she isn't being surveilled. She is able in some way or other just kind of to be free, even though obviously she's still in a lot of pain. And we can see the way that the film constructs this if we just watch this scene. See the crowd. And Rosemary's waiting for Hutch at this point, but she's also just kind of watching people. She sits down.
Pain be gone, I will have no more of thee.
She's even able to laugh to herself, even though she's obviously in a terrible state. That moment is really important. She's waiting for someone, and she sees someone who she thinks might be Hutch. But it's not him. So we're kind of moving already with this little moment from a view of the crowd as anonymous strangers with whom you have no connection, and therefore amongst whom you can hide, to a view of the crowd as people who may well be strangers but who might not be. This is the kind of this is part of the tension in the film, and as the conspiracy becomes more and more real for Rosemary and for the audience, this idea that anyone could be someone who is involved in the conspiracy is used more and more for tension and horror. If we just skip a bit forward, again, look at the way that he's locating. This is typical Manhattan. It's very normal. It's exciting. We know where she is. She's in a big department store. Christmas shopping. These are conventional middle-class activities. And then walking down the street, tracking shot. Notice the way that the background is blurred, so we can't really see, but we just get the sense that she's in the city walking around, and then, oh no.
No! That is what I call a coincidence. Oh, I said to myself, as long as Rosemary's going out, I might as well go out and do a little bit of Christmas shopping. And now here you are, Araya. Isn't that something?
And she meets Minnie, who insists that it's a coincidence that they met. And cities are places where sometimes people have coincidental meetings, but this kind of meeting, this kind of accidental meeting, entirely disrupts Rosemary's frame of mind, as much as she is able to escape from the kind of claustrophobia of the apartment. It's now as if she's kind of immediately back in it. And rather than public space being a space in which you can hide, it's now becoming a space in which, for Rosemary, she can be kind of ambushed at any turn. So the kind of mystery, the unknown quality of the crowd now feels like it could potentially always be hiding something rather than being somewhere where she can hide herself. And we see that really in the phone booth scene, which is one of, I think, the very well constructed scene. And we know that Rosemary is quite desperate. She's going to call her old doctor. She's now convinced that witches are trying to steal her baby. And first of all, notice how we get a kind of claustrophobia within the phone booth itself. So I'll turn up a bit. So we have this close-up of Rosemary. But what I really want you to do is pay attention. Pay attention to the background in this scene, because this is really where the kind of tension emerges from. And it emerges from exactly this idea that anyone could be now someone who is associated with the coven and with the conspiracy.
This is his answering service. Would you like to leave a message?
Yes, my name is Rosemary Woodhouse, and would you ask him to call me back right away, please? My number is 475-2598. It's an emergency. I'm in a phone booth.
All right.
Please, Dr. Hill, call me.
Look at this figure. Who is it? Is it Minnie? Is it someone else?
Oh, really? Did he really say that? Oh, he didn't say that. What else was it that he said? Oh, that's wonderful. That's marvelous. Yes, Dr. Hill?
Did I get the name right? Is it Rosemary Woodhouse?
Yes.
Are you Dr. Hill's patient?
No. Yes. I mean, well, I've seen him once. Please tell him he has to speak to me. It's important. Tell him to call me.
All right.
Thank you. All of them. All in it together. All of them.
Now she's saying all of them. But who is all of them? At what point does all of them end? How many of them is all of them? And yeah, this whole construction of the scene is playing on this idea that they could be everywhere, they could be anyone.
Older than witches. Don't you worry, little Andy or Jenny. I'll kill them before I let them touch you. Yes, Doctor.
Mrs. Woodhouse?
Yes. Oh, thank you for calling me.
I thought you were in California.
No, I've been to another doctor, and he isn't good, Dr. Hill. He's been lying to me and giving me unusual kinds of drinks and capsules. The baby's due on Tuesday. Remember you told me June 28th? Well, I want you to deliver it.
Mrs. Woodhouse.
No, please let me talk to you. Let me come and explain what's been going on. I can't stay too long here. They'll be coming looking for me. Dr. Hill, there's a plot. I know that sounds crazy. You're probably thinking, my God, this poor girl is really flipped. But I haven't flipped, Dr. Hill. I swear, by all the saints, I haven't. There are plots against people, aren't there?
Yes, I suppose there are.
Well, there's one against me and my baby.
Come to my office tomorrow after 5.
No! Right now.
Mrs. Woodhouse, I'm not at my office now. I'm home. I've been up.
That's the moment again where tension in the scene really re-emerges. And it's just the back of someone's head, you know? No reason to believe that this person is anything other than just someone waiting outside of a phone booth, but it's the fact that we don't know. And that Rosemary now, one of the qualities of the city now is that anyone can be a member of the plot, as she says, a member of the conspiracy, a member of the coven. And the film, yeah, so I'll just repeat this for the final time. The film really flips this a kind of safety in anonymity, which was present in Double Indemnity, and it turns their anonymity and the liminality of the crowd of being both an individual and a member of a crowd into a way of generating kind of psychological tension. So, as we say, the scene generates a simple horror, not from the fact that the people in the city are complete strangers, but from the fact that they may not be strangers and may be involved in a conspiracy against Rosemary. So you see enough of the back of the head of someone to recognize that they're old and that they may be, we know that the Coven people are old, at least as we've seen them so far, but we don't know exactly what they look like. We can't tell exactly who that person is from the back of his head. So it's this real, as I say, the uncertainty of public space rather than the anonymity of it. Okay, and the final point, not quite the final point, but something else that I want to say, which is connected to these points historically, but which is not in the film so much directly, but is kind of represented in a slightly ironic way in the film, is the idea of the witch itself and its the relationship of that idea to women's control over their own reproduction and over reproductive rights. And yeah, as a film, Rosemary's Baby is in many ways about just the denial of reproductive or autonomy. Rosemary's body is used by people who consider themselves to own it, and both a control over space and also a control over language is important in that, is an essential part in that. And yeah, the final scene of the film is quite farcical, is quite ridiculous. But I think one of the overriding impressions that it leaves is that the potential, at least in the kind of situations in which the film is set and with the kinds of characters who feature in the film, kind of leaves you with the impression that something as ridiculous as this final scene when Rosemary is kind of revealed, it's revealed to Rosemary she's born the child of Satan, and they kind of have these, they all toast and shout "Hail Satan," and it's kind of funny, I think. Something as stupid as that could happen, given the extent to which Rosemary's agency has been denied, and given the extent to which she is essentially just anonymous and has no control over her reproductive agency, really. And the kind of what I'll just draw your attention to is that the figure of the witch, I think, in this case is kind of ironic, because as the Marxist feminist Sylvia Federici has argued in her seminal text Caliban and the Witch, which some of you may have read or at least have heard of, the witch herself is someone who, or the idea of the witch, often served as an example and as a moral warning in a time when kind of modern ideas of the family and of work and of child rearing were being developed. And we can just look at the two PDFs that I've uploaded just quite quickly. If we start from the highlighted bit, okay. So Federici talks about the role that the idea of the witch played in launching a true war against women, clearly aimed at breaking the control they had exercised over their bodies and their reproduction. This war was waged primarily through the witch hunt that literally demonized any form of birth control and non-procreative sexuality, while charging women with sacrificing children to the devil. Then we have the idea that new forms of surveillance were also adopted to ensure that pregnant women did not terminate their pregnancies. In France, the book is about kind of 15th, 16th, 17th century changes, so it's all based around this historical period, but these are also the historical periods in which witch hunts were prevalent, or in which they occurred, is Federici's argument. And in France, a royal edict of 1536 required women to register every pregnancy and sentence to death those whose infants died before baptism after a concealed delivery, whether or not proven guilty of any wrongdoing. And then we just have the final sentence that I won't read the whole thing, but you can look at it if you would like to, or please look at the book if you would like to. We just have the basic point that the female body was turned into an instrument for the reproduction of labour and the expansion of the workforce, treated as a natural breeding machine functioning according to rhythms outside of women's control. In some ways, this feels like a description of what takes place in Rosemary's Baby. We have a intense surveillance. We have the kind of denial of agency and control to Rosemary. She's not allowed to see the doctor that she wants to see. She's kind of forced to take certain medicines that she doesn't trust. But the history here is upside down. It's topsy-turvy. Because actually, the irony of this is that the witch herself, the image of the witch, is precisely that which was used in order to, or precisely that which played the role in the denial of reproductive agency to women, or emerged at the time in which that reproductive agency was being taken away, is Federici's argument. And then, so we have, again, this is just from the second PDF that I've uploaded. Witch hunting was also instrumental to the construction of a new patriarchal order, where women's bodies, their labour, their sexual and reproductive powers were placed under the control of the state and transformed into economic resources. And we also have this idea that witch hunts serve to punish the poor and serve to create kind of animosity amongst neighbours. And Federici says when women confess to being witches, their poverty stands out. So it was in times of need that the devil appeared to them to assure them that from now on they should never want, although the money he would give them on such occasions would soon turn to ashes. So you have these kind of forced confessions of women who admitted to having seen the devil and to being witches. But Federici is arguing that the vast majority of the time these were poor women. These were women who were being denied access to resources, and many of whom had been thrown out of land that they had previously been able to live on. So yeah, her argument is that the kind of process by which cities, by which the economy, by which things that we now take for granted as being the way in which society is organized, the process by which those things came into being used or produced a kind of certain idea of the witch, and that was useful, or that had the effect of helping to deny women control over their own bodies, according to Federici. And I guess I just wanted to mention that because historically, the irony of Rosemary's Baby is that we see these kind of things being mirrored. We see the way that Rosemary is surveilled. We see the way that she is treated essentially as a baby factory for Satan. But yeah, the irony is that this is done by witches, whereas in reality, the idea of the witch itself was a key role in developing the kinds of structures which, within the film and outside of the film, denied, and in some places continue to deny, women actual access to their own reproductive agency. Okay. So yeah, as I say, the kind of gaslighting that we see in Rosemary's Baby is nothing new. Part of the effect of the film is that it is also nothing especially exceptional, except for the fact that it's being done by witches. But if we took that out of the equation, I think we could still see most of the scenes that we see in Rosemary's Baby, except with a slightly different atmosphere. So the irony of the movie is that while the conspiracy involves witchcraft, the figure of the witch was, according to Federici, produced alongside the processes through which many women lost their own reproductive autonomy in the first place. Okay, so tasks for this week. Choose one of the sequences, either one that I've uploaded or one of your own choosing, and write down several ways in which the camera work, acting, or lighting contributes to its meaning. Send me this if you want to. This is going to be one of the main tasks that I ask you to do every week, because it's good practice and it will be useful for your oral. It's useful to do this practice for when you're getting used to talking about films, which you'll be asked to do for your oral examination. Once you've done that, then have a think about the following questions, which I think that we can try and talk about in the catch-up session if we want to talk about Rosemary's Baby in the catch-up session. So, number one, although the final scene is important in revealing the kind of full extent of the conspiracy, it's also quite farcical and overblown, as I've said. It's, I think, intentionally the funniest scene in the film, in quite a dark way, but it's undeniably funny. And several critics think that the film would actually be better without it, that it would be more of a kind of tightly woven psychological thriller in which you never quite know whether or not Rosemary is making the whole thing up or whether she is indeed the victim of this kind of conspiracy, more than it would be a kind of supernatural horror. And for me, I think, as I said, I think the ending of the film is very, very important. For how we read the whole thing, not just because of the conspiracy, but also because of how we read Rosemary's agency in relation to this. And to put it simply, I think it's important that she's right and that there is no ambiguity about whether or not she was being manipulated and taken advantage of. But yeah, do you agree that the film will be better without the final scene? Why and why not? And the other task is just to think about the shots at the start and the end of the film. The shot of the Branford in particular at the start and the end of the film. And yeah, think about what effect those shots create. Why is it that the movie starts with and ends with this kind of image of the building where Guy and Rosemary live? And how does that contribute to your overall response to what the film is about in terms of the things that we've spoken about today? Okay, guys, that's it. So have a good week. There will be a catch-up session next week. I'll post the stuff about Born in Flames before the weekend so that you have time to watch it over the weekend if you want to. Ignore that. That's a friend sending me a picture of a wombat. And yeah, cool. Take it easy. Speak soon.